Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman and His Left, A Socialist Odyssey Through the, quote, American Century, end quote, by Peter Drucker. This is originally published in 1994, so 30 years ago. At the end of 1928, Shachtman and Cannon freed themselves from the frustrating conflict between their internationalism and their U.S. working class identity when they discovered Trotskyism. Trotsky's criticisms of Stalin's policies gave them an explanation for the communist defeat in the United States and around the world in the 1920s. Shachtman suddenly realized that his and Cannon's loyalty to the Soviet leadership had been misguided. The increasingly reluctant follower of U.S. and international communism became a leader of U.S. and international Trotskyism. Shachtman would remain a Trotskyist through the 1930s and 1940s and contribute to the shaping of Trotskyist thinking and strategy. Trotskyism dovetailed with Shachtman's and Cannon's desire for a Marxism rooted in the U.S. working class. In the mid-1920s, Shachtman and Cannon had subordinated their own convictions about what was best for the U.S. movement to Shachtman and Cannon's loyalty to communists in Moscow, who presumably knew it was best for the whole world movement. Now Trotsky convinced them that what was wrong in the United States was also wrong internationally. He convinced them that communists who were loyal to Stalin were maneuvering with alien forces around the world, unreliable trade union officials in the United States and Europe, technocrats in Soviet factories, middle-class nationalists in Asia. They set out to rescue authentic working-class politics from Stalin internationally and from Lovestone and his supporters in the United States. Many of Cannon's followers broke away from communist orthodoxy along with Cannon and Shachtman. Cannonite malcontents developed into open Trotskyist heretics, and they were expelled by the dozens from the Communist Party in 1928-29. Once U.S. Trotskyists were out of the party, Shachtman became a key organizer of Cannon's new group, the Communist League of America, editor of the Communist League of America's newspaper, The Militant, and founded its publishing house, Pioneer Publishers. Its tiny ranks gradually expanded to 100, then 200 Trotskyists. Shachtman blossomed at first in this small, isolated, embattled group. The Communist Party had frustrated Shachtman's ambitions and neglected Shachtman's talents. The Communist League gave more scope to both. While Cannon led the Trotskyists, Shachtman became Cannon's second-in-command and, quote, idea man, end quote. Shachtman became one of the Trotskyist's star speakers, with a flair that even non-Trotskyists paid grudging tribute to. As a theorist, Shachtman was second to no one among U.S. Trotskyists, as he showed in a long 1933 analysis of African-American oppression and struggle. Although Cannon and Shachtman had been dragged back to New York against their will by the Communist Party, Shachtman was at home as a Trotskyist leader in his native city. A younger, Jewish Trotskyist milieu began to form around him in New York. Al Glotzer moved to New York in 1929 to help out in the Communist League office, cementing his friendship with Shachtman. Shachtman and his wife Billy and Glotzer and his companion Edith Harvey were an intimate foursome. Max's parents in the Bronx welcomed them all into the Shachtman family circle. Shachtman became a mentor and model for New York teenagers, many of them Jewish, who were attracted to the Trotskyists. In the same years that Shachtman settled down in his hometown, Shachtman became a world traveler and international Trotskyist leader. In February 1930, Shachtman visited Trotsky at his home in exile on the Turkish island of Buyukada and began a decade as Trotsky's close disciple and collaborator. Shachtman became Trotsky's emissary to Trotskyists in several countries and an interpreter of Trotsky's ideas. Shachtman combined insights gleaned from Trotsky's analysis of the Kuomintang communist clashes in China and insights he had begun to develop himself in his account of Augusto Sandino's guerrilla war against the Marines in Nicaragua. Shachtman became one of the chief exponents of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Shachtman contributed analyses of opportunities opened up by Palestinian Arab resistance to Zionism, the Indian independence movement, and the 1931 Spanish Republican Revolution. Yet Shachtman and other Trotskyists failed in the early 1930s to change the course of the Communist Party or the Communist International. Although they were right to fear that democracy was being eliminated in the USSR and the communist movement, and right to suspect the Soviets' foreign policy was overriding every other factor in the Internationalist decisions, their analysis of Stalin's policies turned out to be wrong in some other basic ways. Stalin surprised them by collectivizing Soviet agriculture, rapidly building up Soviet industry, and turning communists outside the USSR in ultra-radical directions. A concerted communist campaign of abuse and attack frustrated Trotskyist efforts to influence rank-and-file communists. Trotskyists took out their frustrations on one another in a 1931-33 faction fight, in which impatient young New Yorkers around Shachtman battered older trade unionists around Cannon. Coffee. While Trotskyists remained isolated in their small group, the Communist Party began to grow again as the Depression radicalized thousands of working people. As democracy was virtually extinguished in the communist ranks, communists grew more self-confident and more impervious to outside criticism. Even Stalin's disastrous policy in Germany, which facilitated the Nazis' rise to power in 1933, hardly shook U.S. communist monolithic unity. Although Trotsky internationally and Shachtman and the militant wrote eloquently and insightfully about the catastrophe Stalin helped bring about, Trotskyists came to the reluctant conclusion that the communist movement could not be saved. They would have to use their tiny forces to help build a new movement separate from and opposed to official communism. U.S. communists were surprisingly ignorant about Trotsky's ideas in the 1920s. Beginning in 1924, at the International's insistence, U.S. communists passed resolutions against Trotskyism as quickly as possible, so the U.S. communists could return to the issues they cared about. Quote, "We knew, to put it most bluntly, nothing about the real issues," end quote, Shachtman remembered. However many times they condemned Trotskyism, U.S. communists in the 1920s never really saw Trotsky as a force for evil. They developed a virtual split personality about him, denouncing Trotskyism on certain occasions and praising Trotsky as the organizer of the Bolshevik insurrection and commander of the Red Army on other occasions. The Daily Worker weighed its coverage of the Soviet faction fight overwhelmingly against Trotsky, yet published article after article by Trotsky on international issues. During a 1926-27 visit to Moscow, where he attended a meeting of the International Executive Committee in Cannon's place, Shachtman met a follower of the Trotskyist opposition who explained Trotsky's point of view. Shachtman listened to him intently but made sure not to be convinced. Shachtman's eventual conversion to Trotskyism resulted from an accident that put Cannon on the Program Commission at the International Sixth Congress in Moscow in June 1928. Cannon sat sullen and silent through the commission meetings, which Cannon had been assigned to because other U.S. communists had no interest in them. But Cannon was one of the few Congress delegates to read Trotsky's attack on the draft program submitted to the Congress. Cannon's outlook was transformed. Quote, "It was as clear as daylight that Marxist truth was on the side of Trotsky," end quote, Cannon said. Cannon cast his lot with Trotsky, a Soviet dissident who had been stripped of his job and party membership and sent into internal exile in Central Asia. By another fluke, Maurice Spector was serving on the program commission along with Cannon, an engaging, well-educated, and independent-minded Canadian communist leader. Maurice Spector had begun to have misgivings about the attacks on Trotsky years before. When Maurice Spector had heard about Cannon's general disgruntlement from Shachtman and Marty Abern during a visit to New York in February 1928, he had sought Cannon out and got Cannon to confide in him. At the June meeting in Moscow, Cannon and Spector promised each other that when they got back to North America, they would both speak out in Trotsky's defense. No sooner had Cannon returned to the United States than Cannon began looking for allies in his new fight. Cannon talked first to his wife, Rose Carstner. The second person to whom he showed his precious copy of Trotsky's critique of the draft program was Shachtman. The document did not make for easy reading, Shachtman remembered. The translation was poor and whole sections of Trotsky's work had been chopped out. But Shachtman was convinced. Shachtman remembered years later the document's, quote, "absolutely shattering effect upon my inexcusable indifference to the fight in the Russian party, upon my smug ignorance about the issues involved, about my sense of shame," end quote. Shachtman also remembered the, quote, "positive effect of the critique the quote positive effect the critique had in lighting new horizons, ... and pointing out new roads to tread, end quote. In only 2 or 3 days, Shachtman was one of Cannon's converts. The Trotskyism to which Shachtman became a convert defined itself above all by that Trotskyism's internationalism. Trotskyists believed that they, not the official communists, were the true internationalists as well as the best U.S. revolutionaries. The Trotskyists saw internationalism not just as a bond of loyalty among communists, but as an inescapable necessity for socialism. Shachtman explained, because socialism, quote, arises directly out of the development of the world economy, end quote. Building socialism as an international movement had to come first, even if it sometimes conflicted with the short-term interest of the Soviet Union. Trotskyists believed that communists were putting narrowly defined Soviet interests above the needs of international socialism with disastrous results. One defeat cited by Trotsky as an example of the International's upside-down priorities was the British General Strike of 1926, which was called by the Trade Union Congress to support striking coal miners. The International, which had put together a joint trade union committee of British and Soviet Union leaders to guard against a British attack on the Soviet Union, hailed trade unions Congress officials as leaders of the coming British Revolution. In fact, the officials called off the general strike after 9 days. The British working class won virtually nothing from its mobilization, the British communists still less. Bewildered U.S. communists hailed the strike settlement as a, quote, partial victory, end quote, only to turn around the next day and denounce it as a, quote, betrayal, end quote. Now Max Shachtman had an explanation for the confusion. Stalin had looked to British Union leaders instead of communist workers because Union leaders would protect embryonic Soviet socialism from British attack, even though the Union leaders stood in the way of socialism in Britain. Shachtman and Cannon saw the same upside-down priorities and fruitless maneuvers at work in U.S. communism. For example, in Ruthenberg's enthusiasm for La Follette in 1924, Cannon and Shachtman came to think that the International, lacking confidence in the possibility of a strong working-class movement in the United States in the near future, was trying to squeeze the U.S. party arbitrarily into its shifting short-term quest for allies. In breaking with official communism, Cannonites returned to much of the perspective they had held in 1923 to 25, looking to build a broad working-class radical movement in the long term, but skeptical of coalitions in the short term. For example, Trotskyists were skeptical in the late 1920s and early 1930s about seeing a U.S. Labor Party anytime soon. Cannon had switched to a pro-Labor Party line in 1925, reversing his own position in obedience to the International's desire to find new friends for the Soviet Union in the labor movement. Shachtman had loyally gone along, but Chicago Trotskyists led by Al Glotzer and Tom O'Flaherty pushed reconsideration of the issue in 1929. And Trotsky said in 1930 that he was not sure that there would ever be a Labor Party in the United States. In 1931, thanks in part to Shachtman's pushing, Cannon's followers returned to their old rejection of Labor Party campaigns. The Communist Party, by contrast, had decided in 1928 to continue campaigning for a Labor Party, quote, only from below, end quote, by attacking every other tendency that might help form it. Trotskyists believed that the mindset that accounted for most of communist mistakes was crystallized in Stalin's theory of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. On its face, the theory was a purely hypothetical proposition. Even if new revolutions did not give communists power in other capitalist countries, Soviet communists would still be able, sometime in the indefinite future, to create socialism on their own. For Stalin, the theory was an expression of confidence in Soviet workers and peasants, and Trotsky was a defeatist for insisting that only several advanced countries working together could create socialism. Trotskyists thought that Stalin was the defeatist. The fact that Stalin made socialism in one country the, quote, very axis, end quote, of Stalin's whole policy proved for Shachtman that Stalin had no confidence in socialist victory anywhere outside the USSR for decades to come. Even from the standpoint of Soviet defense, Shachtman said, a strong communist movement was the best guarantee against capitalist attacks. Above all, Trotsky argued, to define socialism as a goal attainable by backward Russia was to debase the idea of socialism. Socialism was supposed to be a society of freedom, equality, and abundance. Shachtman summed up the Trotskyist viewpoint, quote, the proletarian revolution in the West is far closer, than, the establishment of a socialist society in Russia. If it is not closer, then the proletarian revolution is doomed, end quote. Shachtman. Cannon and Shachtman began working in the fall of 1928 to win other communists over to their new perspective, although they dared to approach only members of their own faction whom they trusted, and even then tried only obliquely to raise doubts about the condemnations of Trotsky. In a matter of weeks, they and Abern were facing a formal investigation. Party leaders' first move was to test the suspects by proposing a fresh resolution condemning Trotskyism. Abern voted for, Cannon abstained, and Shachtman voted against. Shachtman later explained that the division was partly, quote, tactile guile, end quote, but it also reflected real differences of opinion among them. Quote, I felt absolutely uncompromising by that time, end quote, he said. Quote, I was for Trotsky's position and I was not going to hide it, end quote. As the investigation wore on day after day, all three found their convictions hardened and their patience diminished. On the 27th of October... Oh, hey, what's up, dude?
Oh, did I...
Yeah, it's okay. No, how are you? 1 second. A homie from the neighborhood saying hello. Where am I? As the investigation wore on day after day, all three found their convictions hardened and their patience diminishing. On the 27th of October, they presented a joint statement of their support for Trotsky. The vultures descended on the three with gusto. Cannon bore the brunt of their attack. Abern faced only a few questions, and Shachtman virtually none. That day they were expelled from the Communist Party. Quote, we set about without a nickel in our pockets, end quote, and no followers, Shachtman remembered, to organize a Trotskyist group outside the Communist Party. He, quote, plunged into it with the greatest enthusiasm, end quote. In the first days after their expulsion, Shachtman, Cannon, and Abern received help from a small group of survivors loyal to the shrunken industrial workers of the world who remembered Cannon from the Union's great days before the First World War. An Italian immigrant in that group provided the Trotskyists with the print shop to issue their new paper, gave them credit for costs of printing it, and even suggested its name, The Militant. Within a week of their expulsion, the handful of Trotskyists took their new publication down to communist headquarters and began to hawk it on the party's doorstep. Soon they had bought their own linotype, learned to use it, and did their own printing in the back of their office. Although Shachtman, Cannon, and Abern were ridiculed as, quote, the three generals without an army, end quote, communist leaders soon provided them with troops. Worried that the Trotskyist heresy had spread further than it really had, the leadership set about extirpating it by introducing resolutions in every cell condemning the three expelled Trotskyists by name. Whenever members voted no or even demanded more evidence before voting yes, they were expelled on the spot. Of course, former Cannon supporters were most likely to balk at the vote. In this way, scores of party members who knew nothing about Trotskyism were expelled as Trotskyists. Once freed from party discipline, most of them were curious to know what it was they had been expelled for and went to seek out the three Trotskyists, who were only too happy to explain. Shachtman's young Chicago friend Al Glotzer heard rumors about his leader's heresy even before their expulsion. He wrote to Cannon, asking him, quote, what the hell was going on, end quote. One morning he received Cannon's answer, galley proofs of Trotsky's document. Glotzer and Chicago Cannonite leaders Arne Swabick read the proofs. Glotzer found them, quote, hair-raising, end quote. He was, quote, aghast, even, quote, sick, but he was influenced by what he read. When Glotzer and Swabick listened to a party leader who had just returned from 3 years at the Lenin School and had supposedly learned all about Trotskyism, they found that the expert's expertise amounted to less than they knew from one pamphlet. They stuck with the communist leaders they knew and trusted, and they were expelled. To their surprise, 2 or 3 others voted against their expulsion and were expelled with them. Not Trotskyists, just old comrades who could not countenance what they were seeing. Most of the first 100 recruits to Trotskyism in the United States were Cannonites who had been expelled in this way. 12 in Chicago, 12 in New York, 24 in Minneapolis, scattered 2s and 3s elsewhere. Quote, our initial success was due to, bracket, skippy leaders, end bracket, narrow and stupid vindictive factionalism, not any effort on our part, end quote. Shachtman reflected. The Trotskyist access to Communist Party members that had been grabbed away with one hand was being given back with the other. The first handful of expelled Trotskyists had been driven away from communist headquarters by communist Führers, i.e. members of the communist-controlled Fur Workers Union, screaming insults while they looked, quote, in utter disbelief end quote, at how their comrades of the day before were treating them. Communists went on to burglarize Cannon's home and beat up militant vendors. But the first few Trotskyists recruited others. Soon they had groups in New York, Chicago, Minneapolis, Cleveland, Boston, Pittsburgh, and Youngstown, Greek Trotskyists, Italian Trotskyists, and Hungarian Trotskyists. In May 1929, the first 100 Trotskyists founded the Communist League of America. Shachtman found himself a leader of the new movement. Shachtman had been the most junior of the Trotskyist three, quote, generals, end quote. Shachtman had become an alternate member of the Communist Central Committee only in 1927. But force of circumstance now pushed him forward. He was young, totally convinced that Trotsky was right, and eager to prove himself. Cannon was willing to let Shachtman try his new wings. In October 1929, Cannon was replaced as editor of The Militant, in theory by a 5-member board, but in actuality mostly by Shachtman. At the time of his expulsion from the Communist Party, Shachtman was 24 years old. Shachtman had spent his 7 years in the party under the shadow of more prominent figures, above all Cannon and Abern. With his emergence into the smaller circle of Trotskyism, Shachtman took on new stature. Not only was Shachtman a bigger fish in a smaller pond, but he also began thinking more independently and creatively. Shachtman's apprenticeship was over, and Shachtman had become a leader in his own right. Although Shachtman had begun as Abern's protege, Abern was now the junior partner in the relationship. Glotzer felt in hindsight that he, as well as Shachtman, had, quote, outstripped, end quote, Abern. Though Shachtman never overshadowed Cannon, Shachtman was no longer overshadowed by Cannon either. People were linking their names automatically. Shachtman and Cannon made a good team because Shachtman and Cannon complemented one another. Alongside his undeniable strengths, Cannon had also had his weaknesses, and Shachtman made up for them. When times were hard, Cannon could sometimes get depressed, drink too much, and work too little. Shachtman, despite a lazy streak, could work through the night for days in a row when he felt impelled to. Cannon did not know any foreign languages and was held back by his lack in international work. Shachtman was more or less fluent in French, German, and Yiddish, could struggle along in Spanish, and picked up a few words of Russian. Shachtman came to enjoy frequent trips and a lively correspondence that made Shachtman the best-known U.S. Trotskyist in the international movement. Cannon respected committed intellectuals, but Cannon was aware of his own shortcomings as a theorist, which reinforced his doubts about middle-class theorists in the radical movement. Shachtman, facile with ideas himself, was much more at ease with the intellectuals who cautiously circled around the movement because of the allure of Trotsky's fame. He became Cannon's, quote, idea man, end quote, while Cannon kept the greater authority. Although Shachtman learned much of what he knew about public speaking from Cannon, Shachtman developed his own style. Trotskyists valued Shachtman, above all for Shachtman's skill and verve as a debater. Shachtman confessed that he, quote, always had a weakness and a fondness for debates and polemics, end quote, and never could, quote, get the polemical style out of my speaking or writing, end quote. Cannon commented sourly that Shachtman's, quote, extraordinary literary facility, end quote, went together with, quote, a no less extraordinary literary versatility, which enabled Shachtman to write equally well on both sides of a question, end quote. But Shachtman never defended a position he did not believe in strongly, at least at the moment. Shachtman could not understand how serious opinions could be defended without passion. Many times when Shachtman could not summon up emotion or conviction, he refrained from taking part in a major debate. When Shachtman did take part, Shachtman had emotion and conviction to spare. Shachtman's speeches became famous. Shachtman, quote, had very mordant wit. Shachtman knew words. Shachtman knew how to fire your imagination. Shachtman was a great mimic, end quote. Shachtman, quote, excelled in destroying an opponent's use of citations from holy texts by... What? Where are you going? Okay. Good luck, Mom. Where am I? Shachtman's speeches became famous. Shachtman, quote, had very mordant wit. Shachtman knew words. Shachtman knew how to fire your imagination. Shachtman was a great mimic, end quote. Shachtman, quote, excelled in destroying an opponent's use of citations from holy texts by restoring them to their proper context. Shachtman was devilish in his mockery of pretension and false learning, end quote. Shachtman had an impressive memory of quotations, names, and statistics. Shachtman was masterful at preparing a good line in advance and producing that line at just the right moment so that the line seemed completely spontaneous. Shachtman also had a gift for long, dramatic build-ups, starting from soft whispers and ending in powerful, parenthesis, though high-pitched, end parenthesis, crescendos. Occasionally, early on in a Shachtman speech, someone would shout, quote, louder, end quote. The speaker would look up and say to the amusement of those who had heard him before, quote, don't worry, end quote. In the end, his voice would, quote, burst forth with powerful resonance, filling up the room and tingling your spine, end quote. In their thoughtful moments, even Shachtman's admirers saw that his oratory had its limitations. Gordon Haskell, a recruit of the 1930s, remembered Shachtman as... I had my phone silenced. Man, this is gonna be one hell of a messy video, but that's okay. All right, now we are. Oh, it's still recording. Thank God. All right. Sorry about that. It's probably going to be really scary when you're listening to this. Anyway, Gordon Haskell, a recruit of the 1930s, remembered Shachtman as a, quote, great inside speaker, end quote. He could always draw a crowd because people knew that they would, quote, have a good time at the expense of the Stalinist or whoever, ... But we didn't attract new people with that, end quote. Although Shachtman often kept people riveted to their seats for 3 or 4 hours, Shachtman could also be long-winded. Glotzer once complained to him about his, quote, infernal non-stop gab, end quote. Shachtman always went over the time allotted to him, and his audience always voted him extensions. Quote, Stalin expected to create socialism in one country, end quote, Trotskyist joked, quote, and Shachtman in one speech, end quote. In one other respect, Shachtman had an advantage over Cannon. Shachtman had more appeal for bright young Trotskyists. His hair and pencil mustache were still black when Cannon's hair was already graying. Shachtman was outgoing. At a time when Cannon was often moody and withdrawn, Shachtman, quote, would talk to anybody anytime, end quote, Glotzer said. Quote, Shachtman's youth would sit around 5-10 of them and talk all afternoon, end quote. People found him easy to talk to. Often they would discuss fine points of socialist theory and practice with him over meals while he indulged his, quote, truly Rabelaisian appetite for food, end quote. Shachtman also had a crude, bawdy, often scatological sense of humor that delighted most of his followers, even when he amused himself by inventing obscene nicknames for them. Hey, man, I'm like Max Shachtman. Anyway, Shachtman did not take on any practical responsibility for organizing younger Trotskyists. In the early 1930s, youth work was still Glotzer's particular field, but given how few Trotskyists there were, dedicated young recruits got to know Shachtman easily. Among them was Joe Carter, a bright, neurotic city college student who had been expelled from the Socialist Youth for Communism at 18 and expelled from the Communist Youth for Trotskyism at 19. Emmanuel, parenthesis, Manny, and parenthesis, Geltman, a Jewish longshoreman's son from Coney Island, joined the Trotskyists after he was denied admission to the Young Communist League at age 14 for reading The Militant. Glotzer brought other young leaders like Nathan, parenthesis, Nady, and parenthesis, Gould into the organization in Chicago. Glotzer, Carter, and Geltman started a Trotskyist youth newspaper, Young Spartacus. Quote, the life was very intense and very close, end quote, Geltman remembered. Shachtman fed this sense of intensity and closeness by his physical affection for his followers. Shachtman would hug them and kiss them. He would pinch both their cheeks hard in a habit that some felt blended sadism and affection. Quote, I think I still have scars, end quote, from Shachtman's pinches, one remembers. Quote, tears would come down your eyes, end quote. Young people who became close to Shachtman could learn an enormous amount from him about Marxist theory and history. Despite his own careless streak, he rarely condescended to young followers or let their efforts go unnoticed or their errors uncorrected. If one of them said something he objected to, quote, Max would say, quote, "You stupid son of a bitch, are you listening to what you're saying?" End quote. Then he would sit down and explain it to you point by point, end quote. He, quote, loved to explode fallacious arguments, end quote. He taught his followers to value intellectual discipline and to delight in catching obscure historical reference in his speeches. Shachtman also encouraged them to write, although he did not have much patience for working with aspiring young writers. In this respect, Geltman felt that he was, quote, closer to Shachtman, but, learned more from Cannon, end quote. Shachtman's way of training new recruits had a particular appeal for his young followers who were Jews. Cannon's young followers were often Jewish too, as were many Trotskyists in the 1930s, but young Jews around Cannon were likely to imitate his blue-collar Midwestern earthiness, while youngsters around Shachtman made little effort to hide their New York background or intellectual skills and tastes. Years later, they could still hear Shachtman's voice in one another's speeches. During the 1930s and 1940s, Shachtman would be one of the most gifted thinkers and writers of the Trotskyist movement. Shachtman acquired great and often justified confidence in his ability to see the shape of things to come before almost anyone else and to see drastic changes the movement would have to make in its thinking and practice in order to keep pace with events. Shachtman grew bitingly and ironically patient with those who did not see the changed reality and the need for changed practice as quickly and thoroughly as he did. Into his disdain for these doubters, there sometimes crept the intonation of a teacher picking on a slow student. But in the 1930s, Shachtman's impatience was counterbalanced by his encouragement, even zest, for no-holds-barred debate. Shachtman valued lively discussion and a critical-minded membership enough to accept even the defeat or dilution of his own positions. As Shachtman's self-confidence and impatience grew, another part of Shachtman's personality came into focus, a certain secretiveness, an occasional unexpected reserve. Shachtman even had a, quote, sort of vindictiveness belied by his surface bonhomie, end quote. I don't know what that means. Bonhomie? B-O-N-H-O-M-I-E, end quote. But in the 1930s, Shachtman's enthusiasm and humor still cast any occasional flashes of temper and shadow. Shachtman became a mentor to many young Trotskyists, not only because of his impressive speeches and lively arguments with his protégés, but also because of his role as leading Trotskyist thinker and writer. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Shachtman focused his intellectual work on an idea that became a Trotskyist hallmark, the theory of permanent revolution. The phrase, quote, permanent revolution, end quote, was first used by Marx in a discussion of the German Revolution of 1848, which Marx said would begin as a revolution to create a German democratic republic and should continue uninterruptedly to the creation of socialism. Trotsky picked up the idea in 1906 as he analyzed the Russian Revolution of 1905 and predicted another revolution to come. The next revolution, Trotsky said, would not only begin the creation of socialism in Russia, but give the signal for socialist revolution in the rest of Europe. Without working-class victories elsewhere in Europe, the Russian Revolution would be doomed to give way to reaction. Trotsky thus described a revolution that would have to be, quote, permanent, end quote, in a double sense, expanding beyond the limits of a narrowly democratic revolution, as well as beyond the boundaries of a single country. The first half of Trotsky's prediction was vindicated by the Russian Revolution of 1917, which virtually wiped out capitalism in the urban centers by the summer of 1918, but no other socialist revolution was victorious in the 1920s. By 1924, Stalin, with his theory of socialism in one country, was challenging Trotsky's attempt to link the Russian Revolution in a single dynamic and international revolution. Trotsky fought against the idea of socialism in one country, but Trotsky fought against it with arguments that had been common to all Bolsheviks until 1924, not with his distinctive catchword of permanent revolution. Trotsky revived and generalized his theory of permanent revolution only in debates over the defeated Chinese Revolution of 1927. In these debates, Trotsky began to argue for the first time that no backward country could win true national independence or self-propelled economic development except under working-class rule, and working-class rule could not survive anywhere unless working-class rule spread relatively soon to several advanced countries. Trotsky rejected Stalin's strategy for China, that the working class should not only ally with peasants should not. Trotsky rejected Stalin's strategy for China that the working class should ally not only with peasants but also with middle-class Democrats to create a democratic, independent but still capitalist republic. And the peasants' self-interested urge to produce for the market and spend in the market could create a big enough internal demand for a country like China. Trotsky argued, development required land reform. Capitalists in the middle class had interests intertwined with landlords that kept peasants living in isolation at a mere subsistence level. They would not push through the necessary agrarian transformation. Only the working class could ally with peasants to carry it out. The Chinese Communist Party started small but exploded into a powerful mass movement in 1925 and 1926. The International encouraged Chinese communists to rely not on their own working class and peasant constituencies, but on the nationalist Kuomintang led by Chiang Kai-shek. As Chiang led his armies northward to unify the country under Kuomintang rule, Moscow ordered communists not to support strikes, not to form Soviets, not to help peasants seize land. Communists in industrial Shanghai led a working class revolt in April 1927 that won control of the city, then welcomed in Chiang's army without a fight, gave up their guns to Chiang's soldiers, and were massacred almost without resistance. At the time, Shachtman presented the official communist response in Labor Defender. After the massacre of the Chinese, supported the Kuomintang, quote, in even greater numbers, end quote, he said. Presumably, Shachtman stuck to the same improbable account in illustrated lecture tour on, quote, revolution and counter-revolution in China, end quote, which Shachtman took to 28 cities in early 1928. But Shachtman changed his mind after reading Trotsky's critique, charging, quote, the Chinese proletariat was prohibited by, the leadership of the Communist International, from fulfilling the role imposed on it by history, end quote. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution gave Shachtman a tool with which he could better understand events around the world. Shachtman was eager to use the theory of permanent revolution. Shachtman published, interpreted, and defended Trotsky's writings about the Russian and Chinese revolutions. Trotsky also kept up the habit from his days at the Daily Worker of reading foreign newspapers. Every now and then he ventured to give his own Trotskyist analysis of events abroad, however fragmentary the information he had. Shachtman did more than apply Trotsky's theory mechanically to every country he looked at. He arrived at independent conclusions that can still inform our understanding of history. Many U.S. communists in the 1920s who were not very clear about what Trotskyism was were unconscious Trotskyists when they wrote about the Third World. Several of Trotsky's works were printed and circulated by the communist press. They were bound to have an influence on communist readers who had not yet been thoroughly inoculated against Trotsky's ideas. Shachtman himself seems to have leaned toward the idea of permanent revolution even before he saw it explained in print. For example, in an article Shachtman wrote in praise of Nicaraguan revolutionary Augusto Sandino in March 1928, Sandino was not a communist but a leader who had emerged from the Nicaraguan Liberal Party to command a guerrilla war against U.S. Marines. U.S. communists backed Augusto Sandino enthusiastically. Like U.S. radicals generations later, they showed their support by a medical aid campaign for the Central American rebels. Contrary to the communist orthodoxy of the day, Shachtman did not expect that Sandino's war could stay limited either to Nicaragua or to a program of independence and democratic reforms. Quote, in Nicaragua particularly, one who leads must lead either into the arms of Wall Street or lead with arms against Wall Street, end quote, Shachtman said. Sandino was leading with arms against Wall Street with considerable success. The Nicaraguan climate and terrain were deadly for Marines. U.S. planes, unchallenged in the air, had to fly so low to see through the forest cover that Sandino's rebels could down them with rifles. But Shachtman did not believe that Sandino could win a lasting victory within Nicaragua alone. Sandino's war, cheered on by Latin Americans everywhere, would be, quote, 100 times more effective, end quote, if it spread to other Central American countries, Shachtman said. Sandino's ultimate victory would come when he, quote, carved out a new historical epoch for the oppressed peoples of the two American continents, end quote. Although Anastasio Somoza's National Guard would betray and kill Sandino in 1934, Shachtman would continue to develop his vision of a Pan-American revolution in more detail later in the 1930s. Shachtman made conscious use of the theory of permanent revolution for the first time during an upheaval in Palestine in 1929. Jewish settlement had provoked opposition from the Arab population of the British colony. The tension finally sparked riots in which Arabs killed Jewish settlers in Hebron, parenthesis, still a focal point of Jewish-Arab conflict on the Israeli-occupied West Bank today, end parenthesis. Reaction to the riots in the U.S. communist press was confused. At the time, Yiddish communist Freiheit condemned the killings as a, quote, pogrom, end quote. This line was abruptly countermanded by party leaders, and the Freiheit turned around to hail the birth of an anti-Zionist, quote, national revolutionary movement, end quote. Prominent Jewish writers left the party in protest. The notion of a, quote, national revolutionary movement, end quote, was bound to make Trotskyists suspicious. They had seen this concept used to justify communist support for the Chinese Kuomintang in 1927 with disastrous results. Shachtman pointed out that the social composition of the Palestinian Arab movement was even less promising than the Kuomintang's had been. The Kuomintang at least included middle-class and capitalist elements. The Palestinian movement was led in 1929 almost entirely by Arab landowners and Muslim religious figures who had scant claims to lead opposition against the British. Many Arab landowners had been responsible for the sale of land to Zionist settlers and the resulting eviction of Arab peasants. During the attacks on Jews, Shachtman did not know of a single shot having been fired at British troops. Shachtman even argued, parenthesis, as Trotskyists argued consistently throughout the 1930s and 1940s, end parenthesis, that the call to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine was reactionary. Shachtman even argued, parenthesis, as Trotskyists argued consistently throughout the 1930s and 1940s, end parenthesis, that the call to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine was reactionary. Marxists had to try to unite Arab peasants with Jewish workers who were fleeing persecution in Europe. Supporting the riots which diverted Palestinians' anger, quote, into pan-Islamic anti-Semitic channels and out of its natural current against British imperialism, end quote, was a typical Stalinist evasion of Marxist responsibility. Supporting the riots which diverted Palestinians' anger, quote, into pan-Islamic and anti-Semitic channels and out of its natural current against British imperialism, end quote, was a typical Stalinist evasion of Marxist responsibility. But Shachtman refused to accommodate too far to Jewish anger at the communist line. The riots did not constitute a, quote, national revolutionary movement, end quote, but neither were they a, quote, nor were they a mere, quote, pogrom, end quote, and he argued. Despite their wrong actions, they were, quote, an uprising of the downtrodden bracket Arab and bracket masses, end quote. Any reliance on the British to suppress them was ruled out. Early in 1930, Shachtman turned his attention to India, a country that would be crucial to his vision of the Third World in the 1940s and 1950s. Here, a well-developed nationalist movement did exist, led by Mohandas Gandhi's Indian National Congress. It gained support from the, quote, land hunger of the Indian peasants, as acute as it is remediable, end quote, since nearly a quarter of India's agricultural land was not under cultivation. There was also a significant industrial working class in India concentrated in the Bombay textile factories. The Communist International's strategy of backing middle-class nationalism seemed feasible in India if it was feasible anywhere. But Trotsky had warned that the methods Stalin used in China would have been even worse consequences in India. Shachtman could draw on a wealth of evidence that Gandhi and Gandhi's Congress were not leading a resolute fight for Indian independence. Already in the early 1920s, Gandhi had called off a tax boycott that was shaking British rule. Gandhi was dismayed by the violence the boycott encouraged. He condemned the burning of police stations, for example, and gave it as a reason for calling off his campaign. To Shachtman, Gandhi's pacifism, which was widely praised then and later, expressed the timidity of native landowners and capitalists who feared peasants' land hunger and workers' discontent. Under their domination, the Congress was willing to accept dominion status, which Shachtman saw as a way for Congress leaders to get government jobs without the dangers of a war for independence. Parenthesis, Dominion status gave a country significantly less independence before the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which gave Dominions control of their own foreign policy. Did I say parenthesis? That was in parenthesis. Parenthesis, Dominion status gave a country significantly less independence before the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which gave Dominions control of their own foreign policy, end parenthesis. In Shachtman's eyes, war or at least large-scale confrontation was a prerequisite to winning true independence. Shachtman could not imagine that anything else would make Britain grant freedom to India, the heart of the British Empire and a source of, quote, almost inexhaustible loot, end quote. If the Congress would not lead a revolutionary war for independence, the task should logically fall on an Indian Communist Party. But in 1930, no Indian Communist Party had been organized, quote, because Stalin was too busy playing with Indian nationalism, end quote. Shachtman's faith in this analysis was shaken after the Second World War, when the Congress succeeded in making India, parenthesis, minus Pakistan, end parenthesis, not only a dominion, but an independent republic within the Commonwealth. Yet independence has not solved the problem of landlessness in the Indian countryside, poverty in the cities, and economic dependence on Europe and the United States. Much of Shachtman's 1930 criticism of Gandhi and the Congress leaders stands up better than the hero worship Gandhi has often received, which in any event has been more uncritical in Europe and North America than in India. Shachtman's first efforts to apply Trotsky's ideas to international events were made using whatever fragments of Trotsky's writings Shachtman could get hold of. Soon, however, Shachtman was able to collaborate with Trotsky. In January 1929, Stalin expelled Trotsky from internal exile in Soviet Central Asia, shipped him to Turkey, where Trotsky settled on the little island of Büyükada near Istanbul. Although Shachtman fretted about Trotsky's safety, Istanbul, quote, swarms with counter-revolutionary white guard vermin, end quote, he said. Trotsky could now help his supporters abroad far more. From then on, whatever formal structures the Trotskyists set up, Trotsky himself was always their real organizing center. In March 1929, U.S. Trotskyists made contact with him. Soon they relied on him for information and advice. For his part, Trotsky wanted his U.S. followers to bear some of the burden of building up the movement in other countries, particularly English-speaking countries. Among the available U.S. Trotskyists, Shachtman was the logical candidate to work as Trotsky's assistant for internal affairs. He was more interested in other countries than Cannon, who did not even visit Turkey until 1934. Shachtman was also willing to beg money from anyone to keep the militant going, since U.S. Trotskyists could not sustain a weekly with their own resources. Their leaders were financing the militant out of their own pockets, even though they had never been paid their back wages when they were fired from International Labor Defense after their expulsion. They could barely afford their dingy Third Avenue office with the old elevated railway, quote, roaring in the window, end quote. So in February 1930, partly to help with international work and partly to ask for money, Shachtman went to visit Trotsky, who was living in Büyükada with his wife Natalia Sadova and their son Lyova, quote, a few blocks from the ferry slip, in an old and somewhat dilapidated mansion, end quote. Shachtman had seen Trotsky only once before, in 1925 in Moscow as Trotsky's car was driving by. Now, for the first time, the two of them met and spoke. Shachtman was overwhelmed at meeting the man he still described in his last years as, quote, the captain of the Bolshevik Revolution, end quote, quote, the most audacious and sweeping revolutionary theoretician of the century, end quote, 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 the most scintillating, the most elegant and most eloquent orator, writer, of the age, end quote, a man whose ideas, quote, opened the minds and lifted the hearts of the best of a whole generation, end quote. Although Shachtman was received warmly, he was, quote, overawed, end quote. Quote, Trotsky always seemed to give the impression of being very tall, although he actually was not. He was a very solid figure of a man, large-framed, large-chested, and that together with the leonine head that everybody commented upon made him look much bigger than he actually was, end quote. In his years of exile, Trotsky was surrounded not only by his family, but by secretaries, messengers, and Trotskyist leaders from different countries, sacrificed by their own organizations to the needs of the international movement. His house was never so much a home as a headquarters. For Shachtman, his stay in Buyak Ada was a new education in work. He had worked hard before, but he was a little sloppy, notorious for missing deadlines and appointments. Quote, he could write well when he chose to write well, when you could push him to write, end quote. He once said apologetically to an ill-treated correspondent, quote, you know, A, how it is, and B, how I am, too late to change, end quote. Trotsky judged work not by what was enjoyable or easy or even possible, but by what was historically necessary. Since the Trotskyist movement set itself historical tasks far beyond its means, Trotsky drove himself and everyone around him always to do more. Despite malarial attacks, headaches, and continual pestering by reporters who wanted his opinions on religion or art, Trotsky worked on a rigid schedule. His sweater was always buttoned, his tie was never loosened, his posture was always erect. He set his followers to work answering his mail by day and patrolling the grounds with a flashlight by night. He had no time for idle speculation or gossip, although he would go so far as mild teasing of his younger followers and was often sarcastic. He also had time for long talks with Shachtman, of which Shachtman said, quote, I am learning more for myself and our movement by my daily talks with him on 1,000 different subjects than I could learn from 1,000 books, end quote, Shachtman. Trotsky could be warmly appreciative and even affectionate towards those who he felt earned it, but his judgments almost always rested, parenthesis, or so he thought, end parenthesis, on some objective basis. When Trotsky decided that his regard was no longer merited, he withdrew it. Shachtman was struck at not finding, quote, a trace of personal animosity or personal bitterness or personal hatred of Stalin in anything that Trotsky said or did, end quote. Shachtman, for his part, took his politics personally and sometimes a little lightly. Trotsky dismissed the streak of frivolity that sometimes leavened Shachtman's politics as, quote, clownishness, end quote. He also distrusted Shachtman's occasional freewheeling speculations, quote, Shachtman plays with ideas, end quote, he complained. Trotsky had only two forms of relaxation on Buyak Ada, characteristically productive ones, hunting and fishing, which he enjoyed immensely. Shachtman would dutifully set out with him, quote, at the ungodly hour of 5 a.m, which in those days was just about the time I was falling asleep in my room, end quote. Occasionally on hunting or fishing expeditions, Trotsky would run into local farmers or fisher people, and he would question them for hours about how they made a living, their customs, their politics. When he went fishing, he would set up the nets with military efficiency under the guidance of a local fisherman and haul in quantities of fish or the lobster-like shellfish called langoust. None of it was wasted. Quote, we used to have langoust for breakfast, lunch, tea, and dinner day in, day out, ... until I thought I would never want to look at langoust again for the rest of my days, end quote. But no one who entered Trotsky's household dared to quibble over minor matters like food. About one Trotskyist who had come to Buyak Ada, a vegetarian, Shachtman joked, quote, ah, that Buyak Ada air, it makes the tamest men carnivorous, end quote. Shachtman won Trotsky's confidence during that first visit to Buyak Ada. Trotsky could forgive a lot in a person who was loyal and committed to the cause, and Shachtman had loyalty and commitment in abundance. Trotsky decided that he could use Shachtman in his dealings with the various Trotskyist groups. When the Trotskyist movement set up its first international bureau in 1930, Shachtman became its only non-European member. Every year or two, Trotsky would ask him to come to Europe to visit, and after talking at length with Trotsky, Shachtman would set off on missions that would keep him away from the United States for months. One of the missions brought Shachtman in 1931-32 to the new Spanish Republic, which had been proclaimed in the spring of 1931 after dictator Primo de Rivera had been overthrown and the king had abdicated. With the beginning of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, the Spanish Republic would become the favorite cause of communists and leftists around the world, and Trotskyist criticisms of the Republican regime would cut them off from the mainstream of international socialist opinion. All these later criticisms can be found in Shachtman's account of politics in the Republic's first months. Repression against the left and the workers' movement did not begin with General Francisco Franco's 1936 revolt. There was harsh repression even under the left-leaning coalition that first governed the Republic, as Shachtman saw during his visit. In the new regime's first weeks, the government suppressed a general strike and imposed martial law in the Catalan working-class center of Barcelona. The hated Civil Guard, was used to break strikes, beat up demonstrators, and even fire on peaceful rallies. The government required people to carry internal passports, sent police into union meetings, and jailed its opponents for months at a time without trial. Once again, for Shachtman, Trotsky's theory explained the Republic's, quote, brutally anti-labor character, end quote. Quote, the Spanish bourgeoisie, now in power, is bound by 1,000 threads to the old monarchical system and the semi-feudal relationships on the land, end quote. The Spanish Socialist Workers Party, led by Francisco Largo Caballero, was complicit in all these repressive measures, since 3 socialist ministers sat in the first Republican government. Largo Caballero had been a counselor of state, even under the dictator Primo de Rivera. The socialists were incapable of improving people's living standards, Shachtman said. The main working-class opposition to the regime came from the anarchists, strong in the Catalan East. But anarchist opposition was made fruitless by the refusal to set up working-class conquest of power as a goal, he argued. Refusing to recognize the state, anarchists were, quote, completely discomfited and checkmated when the, quote, social myth, end quote, of the state turns up at every corner, end quote. Anarchists' refusal to organize workers for insurrection resulted in, quote, bleeding them slowly in futile skirmishes, end quote. Spanish communists, divided into 3 different groups, were far weaker than either socialists or anarchists. The official communists who were loyal to Stalin had discredited themselves, first by taking no part in the Republican Revolution, then by calling immediately for its overthrow and replacement by Soviets, without even pausing to put forward democratic demands that the government's opponents could rally around. Quote, the Stalinists acted throughout like the man who has come too late for his train and then after going home because, quote, there is still time for the next one, end quote, misses that one too, end quote, Shachtman said. Shachtman already suspected that Stalin preferred not to run the risk of a Spanish socialist revolution, which might set off a European war that would be dangerous to the Soviet regime. The weakness of socialist anarchists and official communists left an opening for Catalan and Spanish Trotskyists. Shachtman met and liked the Trotskyist leader Anjunin and Juan Andrade. Shachtman was excited at the prospects open to them. Quote, a successful proletarian revolt in Spain, is a, quote, absurdity, end quote. Only to such people as regarded a Bolshevik victory as absurd as in the early part of 1917, end quote, Shachtman said. If Trotskyists could push aside the floundering Stalinists, build up a strong communist party, and lead a revolution, international Trotskyism would get the same powerful momentum behind it that Bolshevism had gotten from the Russian Revolution. Trotsky and Trotsky's followers were convinced in the late 1920s that Stalin and his faction were heading to the right. Trotsky attacked Soviet leaders for making too many concessions to farmers and merchants and doing too little to collectivize agriculture and build up industry. Trotsky believed that even if the bureaucrats running the Soviet Union put up episodic resistance to capitalist forces, they would always end by making more concessions. Trotsky still saw capital and labor as the 2 fundamental forces in conflict in Soviet society and thought that the bureaucracy was only a vacillating, fragmented force between the 2 important ones. Trotsky expected the bureaucracy to be torn apart between capital and labor as the conflict between them intensified. Within the International in the late 1920s, Trotsky attacked the leadership for its softness and the leadership's misplaced faith in trade union leaders and middle-class nationalists. Shachtman and Cannon pointed to the rightward course of U.S. communists under J. Lovestone. Trotskyists were convinced that U.S. capitalism was headed for severe storms that would show the foolishness of Lovestone's strategy. They expected rank-and-file communists to grow more discontented and listen more attentively to Trotskyist criticisms. But Trotskyists were wrong in some important ways about the Soviet Union, wrong about the Communist International, and wrong about the U.S. Communist Party. Above all, Trotsky drastically underestimated the dynamism of the Stalinist bureaucracy and the solidity of the social system the Stalinist bureaucracy was creating. No sooner had Shachtman become a Trotskyist than Shachtman had to begin a rethinking of Trotskyism that lasted throughout the 1930s and 1940s. New developments began to diverge from Trotsky's predictions almost as soon as he was expelled from the party in November 1927. That winter, the wealthier farmers, kulaks, in the Soviet Union, discontented with grain prices and with the shortage of industrial goods for them to buy, failed to sell enough grain to the cities where the workers were dependent on it for their survival. Stalin resorted to forced requisitions of grain for the first time since the Civil War years of 1918 to 1921. The requisitions were often brutal, and moderates in the party leadership were outraged. But the same crisis recurred in the 1928 harvest, and the balance in top party circles shifted in Stalin's favor. Stalin began repeating Trotsky's warnings about the threat from the party's right wing. By 1929, Stalin, willingly or unwillingly, was heading for the confrontation with farmers that he had been avoiding throughout the 1920s. Stalin ended up carrying out a far more rapid and violent transformation of Soviet society than Trotsky had ever dreamed of. In the space of a year, Stalin herded more of the USSR's rural inhabitants into collective farms. By 1930, as farmers slaughtered the livestock and resisted working the land they felt had been stolen from them, the Soviet Union faced chaos and starvation. Epidemics of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid swept the country. People ate the bark off trees or even one another. Stalin retreated, allowing many farmers to regain their private plots. But in 1931, Stalin again reversed directions, speeded up collectivization. Meanwhile, he kept pushing up the rates of industrial growth demanded by his first five-year plan, up to the 20% rate of growth he had ridiculed when Trotsky suggested it, and higher still. Hours and days of work were stretched, real wages were cut to provide funds for investment, and output in heavy industry skyrocketed. The zigzags in Stalin's policy allowed Trotskyists to say, at first, that he would never stick to his program, or at least he would face challenges in the party and be forced to welcome the Trotskyists back. Shachtman argued that Stalin's anti-kulak slogan could not be taken at face value. But Trotsky gradually shifted the main thrust of his criticism. Without denying the gains the Soviet Union was making, he pointed out that Stalin's policies were driving the country further from socialism in at least as many ways as they were moving it closer. The limited role workers had played in managing the economy at the end of the 1920s had been taken away from them. The Communist Party had ceased to be a workers' party in almost anything but name, since workers were swamped and manipulated by government bureaucrats. As real incomes fell and incentives to make people work harder grew, the economic gap between bureaucrats and workers and the inequality among workers widened. The undemocratic character of the regime grew more pronounced. Stalin's new course had important consequences outside the USSR as well. By 1929, Stalin was imposing a, quote, panic-stricken, chartless ultra-radicalism, end quote, on the world's communists. According to the International's analysis, capitalism in the early 1930s had entered a, quote, third period, end quote, of imminent collapse. In this situation, the main enemy of communists everywhere was not the rising fascist movement or conservatives, but social democrats, who had combined guile with repression to distract workers from revolution and were labeled, quote, social fascists, end quote. The tactics dictated by this, quote, third period, end quote, line were endless ideological attacks on other leftists, street fighting, and splits in non-communist controlled unions. In the United States, Lovestone was deserted by most of his supporters and expelled from the Communist Party when he resisted, quote, third period, end quote, tactics. By 1930, an old friend of Cannon's from pre-war Kansas City, Earl Browder, emerged as the party's new general secretary. Communists ordered all their trade union supporters into futile splits and weak communist-controlled unions. Shachtman said that the theory of, quote, social fascism, end quote, had, quote, brought the communist movement to its knees, end quote. Shachtman warned that trade union splits and heavy-handed party control of the new unions were decimating the communist base. Quote, the workers are not chessmen that can be moved about unresistingly by, quote, master strategists, end quote, end quote. The Communist Party could not be saved from isolation without a rebirth of democracy in the Communist Party's ranks, he said. But communist change, of course, confused Trotskyists, he said later. They had foreseen the parties going further and further to the right, and it was not. Meanwhile, the sneaking admiration that most U.S. communists had had for Trotsky withered under an intensive campaign of accusations and physical attacks. Lovestone's replacement by Browder made no difference. To Trotsky's shock, One of the first public meetings they tried to hold was broken up by communists with, quote, blackjacks, knives, lead pipes, brass knuckles, and other subtle political arguments, end quote. Although Trotskyists, parenthesis, quote, female as well as male, exclamation point, end quote, Shachtman said, end parenthesis, somehow managed to defend their meetings from disruption, the attacks went on unremittingly for 2 or 3 years. Shachtman marveled years later at communist, quote, extraordinary hostility, end quote, toward Trotskyists. Quote, the source of this hostility was deep and it was strong. The overwhelming passionate attachment that every communist had to the Soviet regime, to its leadership as the incarnation of the Bolshevik Revolution, which was under constant siege from a hated and encircling capitalist world, end quote. The communist attacks solidified Shachtman's conviction that he and other Trotskyists were right. Why else would communist leaders be so defensive and resort to such outrageous lies? Shachtman could see that those who stayed in the party were forced to accept absurdities. In an otherwise respectful obituary for German communist leader Clara Zetkin, Shachtman said that the best of communists were suffering from, quote, a gag in the mouth, a terrible spiritual degradation, end quote. Shachtman was all the more convinced that disseminating the facts and promoting free discussion would guarantee Trotskyist victory in the end. Meanwhile, the Trotskyists tacitly began to function as an independent group rather than as a communist faction. They focused on what little work in the unions and among the unemployed they could manage with their small forces. Shachtman assembled a small staff that kept the Communist League going. Al Glotzer, who had moved to New York to run the office while Shachtman went to Europe, stayed in New York after Shachtman came back, working in the subway 9 hours a day, sometimes 7 days a week, and helping out in the office in his free hours. Maurice Spector, the Canadian Trotskyist sympathizer, also moved to New York after being expelled from the Communist Party of Canada. Maurice Spector easily fit into the group around Shachtman since he too was a young Jew born in Eastern Europe. Often after putting the militant to bed, the group would go off to an Italian restaurant on 2nd Avenue. Trotskyists were involved less in activism than in propaganda for Trotsky's views. Shachtman founded a small Trotskyist publishing firm. In 1929, they issued Trotsky's Critique of the Communist International's program, their, quote, Bible, end quote, as a pamphlet. In 1930, Shachtman got hold of a German edition of the previously unknown missing second section, which he translated and published as a second pamphlet. He went on to translate Trotsky's book on permanent revolution from German, parenthesis, which he modestly remarked was, quote, easy for me, end quote, end parenthesis, and told Trotsky that the Trotskyists were, quote, proud and happy to have been able to issue the book in our own name, end quote. To publish his and other translations, he founded Pioneer Publishers. Its list grew, a pamphlet on the situation in Germany, one on Stalin's 5-year plan, one on the Spanish Revolution, one on French trade unions. Ownership of their linotype machine allowed Trotskyists to put out a newspaper in Yiddish and one in Greek with a simple change of character sets. Shachtman could count on his family to ease the hardships of a revolutionary organizer's life. On Friday nights, he and Billy Ramloff would have dinner with his parents and sister. Often, Glotzer would come along. Soon Glotzer was bringing along a companion of his own, Edith Harvey, still legally married to a man who had worked alongside Shachtman as the Young Workers' business manager. Ramloff and Harvey, an intelligent, strong-minded woman a little older than Glotzer, were best friends. They completed a warm little circle around the Communist League office. Yet the work got harder, not easier. Shachtman had come back from Buyak Ada with political guidance and inspiration, but not the money the Trotskyists needed. Trotsky urged him to save the weakly militant, but the only practical help Trotsky could offer was the profits from the Yiddish edition of his autobiography. Shachtman was utterly discouraged. Quote, I am essentially responsible for ... everything under the sun. I suppose it would have been the better part of self-satisfied wisdom and caution to have retreated and continued to retreat at the very beginning. Unfortunately, I cannot yet, in spite of everything, get it into my thick, stubborn head that such a course is more correct than the one decided upon ... It is with difficulty that I turn away from this subject, because in less than 2 hours it has become like a gargoyle fixed before me and mocking me, end quote. By the end of July 1930, Shachtman had to admit failure in the effort to keep the militant a weekly. It became a semi-monthly again. Shachtman's frustration resulted inevitably from the constraints Trotskyists worked under in the early 1930s. They were still trying to reach and recruit communists, yet the communist movement was one of the last places they could expect to get a hearing. Communist League membership reached about 100 in the year of its foundation. It barely reached 200 during the next 3 years. During those same years, with the impetus of the Depression, the communists began a spurt of growth that gave them something approaching mass influence. In the history of the U.S. left, only the Socialist Party in the 1910s had a greater impact on U.S. political life than communists did in the 1930s. Communist success made them even less disposed to question their leaders and doctrines. By the early 1930s, the idea of the Trotskyists gaining readmission to the Communist Party seemed far-fetched. Quote, I think that we all knew in our hearts that it was just about impossible, short of a miracle, and there were very few of us trained to believe in miracles, end quote, Shachtman said. The Trotskyists were in a dead-end alley. Their difficulties took a toll on their handful of leaders, whose hard jobs building the movement did not always give them enough money to eat or pay the rent. For Cannon, who had years of radical activity behind him and had led far more impressive organizations, the toll showed in resignation and tendency to hoard his energy for a time, and then it could be spent more fruitfully. When his first wife died, Cannon and Carstner had 2 more children to take care of, and he was forced to take a job with the New York Tribune's circulation department. Cannon drank more. Cannon talked about moving to Kansas City and getting a job in a hotel with his brother there. For Shachtman, trying his wings as a leader, the toll showed impatience and resentment toward Cannon, who he felt was not pulling his weight. As Shachtman struggled to keep putting out a weekly militant, Shachtman wrote to Spector, quote, pardon me if I sound bitter, but when Cannon, proposes at this date that we return to a semi-monthly, I cannot but entertain a harsh resentment, end quote. Abern, Glotzer, and Spector joined in Shachtman's criticisms. Cannon, stung, accused Shachtman of wanting to squander Trotsky's limited resources on extravagant, hopeless projects. Soon longtime allies of Cannon's, Midwestern trade unionists such as Arne Swabek in Chicago and Ray Dunn in Minneapolis, lined up against the younger leaders in the New York office. From these petty beginnings arose charges and countercharges that divided the Trotskyists through most of the 1930s and 1940s. Cannon argued that he had been the leader of the Communist Party's, quote, proletarian kernel, end quote, and was still the leader of the, quote, proletarian kernel, end quote, in the Communist League. He seemed to imply that he had an ironclad claim to leadership. He dismissed his critics as middle-class journalists and intellectuals who did not understand working-class politics in their bones the way he did. Many rank-and-file workers who came around the group sympathized with Cannon's demands for loyalty and Cannon's impatience with intellectual discussion. The U.S. working class has often been suspicious of intellectuals for good reasons, since people with education have often used it to manipulate or domineer over working people. Cannon trusted and appealed to these working-class instincts. But this egalitarian strength of U.S. working-class culture has also been a weakness for revolutionary working-class politics. The countries where Marxism has been strongest, Germany and Russia before 1917, France and Italy after 1945, and more recently Latin American countries, have each had a strong philosophical tradition that gave Marxism a cultural context. Working-class radicals in these countries have identified with this intellectual tradition. They have been willing to work hard to master it, and as a result have acquired the self-confidence to challenge middle-class leaders in debate. Lack of this intellectual climate among U.S. workers has often left them at the mercy of trade union officials with a superficial, often pro-capitalist outlook, and of middle-class intellectuals who show little interest in working-class struggles. Shachtman's eagerness to promote debate and theoretical discussion among U.S. Trotskyists showed a conviction of their importance for that Cannon did not fully share. Shachtman wanted to claim communist traditions as, quote, our traditions, end quote. But Shachtman kept an open, critical mind about the traditions of the Cannon faction. He later said that, quote, 9/10, end quote, of the Cannon's group's platform, such as the pro-Labor Party position it adopted in 1925, was wrong. Cannon and his allies charged that, Shachtman and his allies charged that Cannon should not abide critics and could not abide critics and wanted to impose on the Communist League a, quote, spurious and strangulating, quote, monolithism, end quote, end quote. This is the beginning of complaints about the Cannon, quote, regime, end quote, that would persist in U.S. Trotskyism even after Cannon's death. Shachtman's followers warned against giving old Cannonites special status and creating an atmosphere of, quote, hereditary succession, end quote. They encouraged younger Trotskyist ambitions and pushed to add young recruits to the National Committee. In international Trotskyism, Shachtman showed the same desire for freewheeling discussion and tolerance for differences that raised Cannon's hackles in the United States. Shachtman strained his friendship with Trotsky by questioning Trotsky's intervention in fights among German and French Trotskyists. Shachtman, who had come to believe that Shachtman could say whatever he thought to Trotsky, was hurt and bewildered. He was also afraid that Cannon would use Trotsky's reproaches against him, but he never dreamed of breaking with Trotsky. Quote, I could wish for nothing more ardently, end quote, than reconciliation, he told Trotsky. Shachtman condemned his own second thoughts about Trotsky's stands. Shachtman condemned his own second thoughts about Trotsky's stands. Trotsky expressed, quote, great relief, end quote, that Shachtman had given in and their friendship could, quote, now develop unhurt, end quote. Trotsky exerted himself to reconcile Shachtman with Cannon. Trotsky chided Cannon's allies with their, quote, for their, quote, intransigence, end quote, and Shachtman for his, quote, impatience, end quote. By the summer of 1933, Shachtman was ready to give up the dispute. Shachtman urged his allies to follow Trotsky's advice. Quote, if your estimate of Cannon and his group is correct, end quote, he added, quote, you have only to wait, end quote. Shachtman ventured to disagree with Trotsky on one more issue in the early 1930s, the Black Movement. Communists and Trotskyists were unique among pre-1950s U.S. white radicals in the attention they paid to injustices perpetrated against African Americans. Their awareness of racism resulted from pressures put on them by comrades abroad, particularly by Lenin on the communists and later Trotsky on the Trotskyists. Before they experienced these pressures, communists were happy enough to continue in the tradition of Debsian socialism, which saw racism as a shame and something that should be banished from the socialist movement, but not as one of its particular concerns. Lenin's vision of a revolutionary party as a, quote, tribune of all the oppressed, end quote, forced communists to give African American struggles a higher priority than any white radicals had since Reconstruction. Lenin and Trotsky saw African American oppression and liberation in the same framework as other oppressed people's struggles around the world. They tended to define African Americans as a, quote, oppressed nation, end quote, or, quote, oppressed national minority, end quote, within the United States, fighting for its national rights. Their approach reached a kind of culmination in the early 1930s when the communists called for a, quote, black belt republic, end quote, in black majority areas of the South. Most Trotskyists, like most radicals outside the Communist Party, thought that the black belt position made no sense. Although the September 1931 Communist League Convention reached no formal decision on the issue, the delegates had an informal consensus that the slogan should be rejected. Among Trotskyists, Shachtman was one of the most eager to repudiate it and develop an alternative strategy. By the end of 1932, he was speaking for the League and posing the alternative, quote, the Negroes in America, national or proletarian revolution, end quote. Trotsky was not attached to the black belt position, but Trotsky would never frame the issue as working class revolution or African American national revolution. He saw the African American movement in the United States as an autonomous movement that over the course of time would make its own particular demands, if not a separate state, than African American community institutions in some other form. Shachtman did not share Trotsky's interest in a separate African American movement, which seemed to him to have value only in limited struggles against segregation and discrimination. African Americans already striking integration into the U.S. working class seemed more important to Shachtman in the long run. Quote, tens of millions of American workers and poor farmers, end quote, suffered under the same system that African Americans did, he said. The whole U.S. labor movement was, quote, inseparably connected with the position and interests of the black millions, end quote. Shachtman came to realize that he was headed outside the framework of Trotsky's approach. In April 1933, Shachtman told Trotsky that he could not agree with Trotsky's analysis of African American struggles in the United States. He laid out his own viewpoint as an 80-page document, quote, Communism and the Negro Question, end quote. The situation of African Americans in the modern United States was the consequence of events after the Civil War, Shachtman said, and especially of the fact that the northern capitalists who won the Civil War were willing to give African American freedmen, quote, the short end of the stick, end quote, afterwards. The Democratic Revolution in the South, advocated by radical Reconstructionist Republicans, never occurred. Instead, the old slaveholders became the rulers of the New South and used their power to reduce African American tenants to, quote, unspeakable, end quote, misery. As a result, after the turn of the century, African Americans migrated from the southern countryside to mostly northern industrial cities. African Americans had fallen from 36% of the southern population in 1880 to 24.7% in 1930. Shachtman pointed out, and the urban African American population had risen from 1 million and 1 million to 5 million, from 1.5 million to 5 million. The 1930s was, quote, the epoch of the industrial Negro, the leader of his race, the comrade in arms of the white proletarian, end quote. The capitalist response to African American problems was, quote, the Roper torch of the lynching mob, end quote. For that reason, the first fight African Americans had to wage was against the racism that isolated and cowed them against Jim Crow. But Shachtman had little use for the policies of either the mainstream black movement or most of the white left. Middle-class African Americans lived off of segregation in the separate black market that segregation created. They wanted better lives for African American, quote, roughly in the same sense that the Standard Oil Company favored the adoption by the Chinese of the kerosene lamp, end quote. They were willing to cooperate with white liberals in running groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, which opposed African Americans fighting, quote, belligerently or, quote, offensively. Shachtman was just as opposed to the colorblindness of the Socialist Party and its leader, Norman Thomas. Shachtman quoted African-American socialist W.E.B. Du Bois against Thomas, but went on to criticize Du Bois's scheme for African-American cooperatives. All these reformist schemes were bound to fail because they remained within capitalist limits. Shachtman was sure that capitalists would never, quote, even attempt as much in the emancipation of the Negro, end quote, as was attempted during Reconstruction. He said that the communist program for a black belt republic was also wrong. African Americans do not constitute a nation any more than Jews do, he argued. Neither has a distinct language, a distinct territory, parenthesis, any boundaries drawn from the black belt would be arbitrary and exclude most African Americans, end parenthesis, or a common culture. The demand for a separate African American nation had never been raised in the Communist International under Lenin. The whole idea was the result of communist abandonment of permanent revolution and their search for halfway solutions that they hoped would be palatable to middle-class people, he said. But there was no halfway solution for African Americans. Quote, the Negro will not only be liberated from the wage slavery of today, but the survivals of feudalism and slavery will be exterminated as a, quote, byproduct, end quote, of the military political struggle of the last progressive class in American society, the class of black and white proletarians, to establish a socialist nation, end quote. The real workers' movement had always tried to unite with African Americans against racism, according to Shachtman, from the National Labor Union of the 1860s to the Industrial Workers of the World, Communist Party, and United Mine Workers. There should be no wall dividing African American struggles from workers' struggles. Quote, the two flow together in a single movement, end quote. Shachtman acknowledged that white workers bore the main responsibility for the choice between unity with African Americans and victory or division and defeat. But he was unclear in laying out how this unity should be achieved. He said only that whites should join in, quote, the uncompromising demand for full and equal rights for the oppressed Negro, end quote. U.S. Trotskyists turned away from Shachtman's distinctive approach in 1939 when they adopted a position worked out by Trotsky and Black Trinidadian Trotskyist C.L.R. James that looked toward an independent African-American struggle. Even in the 1940s, Shachtman's followers never formally abandoned Trotsky's views for this, but stands they took over the years illustrate the positive and negative consequences of his approach. They fought together with African-American workers to increase African-American participation in the unions and keep prejudice out of the factories during during the Second World War. But when soldiers came back from the war in 1945 and many African Americans were fired to make way for returning whites, Shachtman and his fellow leaders came out against the idea of African American, quote, superior seniority, end quote, to protect African American gains. They said that such a proposal would, quote, sow discord, end quote, sending African American women who had seized wartime opportunities to escape from poorly paid and demeaning domestic work back into it at the war's end apparently did not sow discord. Racism caught Shachtman's attention mainly when it disrupted working class unity in some obvious way. During the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, all communists and Trotskyists were united in their support for African American struggles against racism, struggles that the great majority of other whites viewed with hostility or indifference. The differences between Shachtman and other U.S. radicals on African American issues seemed relatively unimportant. If Trotsky is remembered for one contribution Trotsky made after he fell from power in the Soviet Union, that contribution is undoubtedly his warning about the danger of German fascism. After the Nazis got 6 million votes in 1930, Trotsky said that whoever did not see the danger of fascism was, quote, either blind or a braggart, end quote. While German communists were still treating Social Democrats as their main enemy and saying that after Hitler's day theirs would come, Trotsky urged the German communists repeatedly to unite with Social Democrats to stop the Nazis' rise to power. German Trotskyists energetically distributed Trotsky's writings in hopes of changing communist policy. In response, Al Glotzer found when he visited Europe in 1931-32 that communists were, quote, denouncing Trotsky every day, end quote. The vindication of Trotsky's warnings lifted his and his movement's prestige, but the failure to stop Adolf Hitler set back European socialism for years. Trotskyists saw official communism as an obstacle, not only in the fight for socialism, but even in the defense of basic democratic freedoms under capitalism. Shachtman joined in Trotsky's warnings. As early as 1929, Shachtman accepted Trotsky's characterization of the United States as the, quote, basic counter-revolutionary force of the modern epoch, end quote, warned that U.S. policies were spreading war and dictatorship. In the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. government was the direct source of violence and repression, as when President Herbert Hoover sent Marines to Nicaragua and Haiti. In Europe, U.S. policies had equally deadly, though indirect, results. The United States tried to extract reparations from Germany and war debt payments from the Allies. Shachtman said that U.S. capital is trying to find a way out of the, quote, maelstrom of world economics, end quote, at Germany's expense. Even before the Nazis' rise to power, he predicted that Germany's rulers would squeeze the working class hard in order to get the money that the United States, Britain, and France demanded. The political result of these economic pressures was a movement for, quote, naked dictatorship, end quote. Back from his visit to Europe at the beginning of 1932, Shachtman warned of the Nazis by name with redoubled urgency. A Nazi victory would not only, quote, exterminate the flower of the German proletariat, but would inaugurate a prolonged period of reaction throughout Europe, end quote, Trotsky said. Yet communists not only rejected unity with Social Democrats, but watched the Nazis rise, quote, without firing anything more deadly than a manifesto, from exile, end quote. Shachtman explained that the preservation of German capitalist democracy was in the interest not only of the working class, but also of at least part of the capitalist class. In a country with a well-organized working class, Shachtman said. The ruling elite would usually prefer to conciliate and co-opt the left rather than attack it frontally. As long as order could somehow be maintained by constitutional means, the state would keep the fascists, quote, in reserve, end quote. But the pressure to increase profits at workers' expense was growing because of the Depression. German unions and socialist organizations were the main obstacle. Divided and weakened as they were by communist and social democratic policies, they made a tempting target. Shachtman was not surprised that in these circumstances, Germany's ruling and middle classes turned to Hitler. Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933 galvanized Trotskyists into a frenzy of activity. They argued that fascism could still be stopped in Germany if only German communists changed course and acted decisively. No effort could be spared. Even pressure from the remote United States had to be brought to bear. Over 500 people turned up in Manhattan to listen to Shachtman and Cannon talk about the German events, and another 500 in the Bronx in February 1933. Official communist spokespeople even showed up and took the floor, but there was nothing they could do to stop the wave of criticisms that rolled at them from communist sympathizers in the audience. Although Trotskyists had been managing to put the militant out once a week again through most of 1931 and 1932, only by struggling and begging, they seized on people's eagerness to read about Germany by putting it out 3 times a week now. Shachtman wrote lead articles about Germany under front-page banner headlines in almost every issue. Shachtman had predicted the worst outcome in Germany over a year before, but he spared no effort now to prove himself wrong. A victorious Hitler, Shachtman said, would, quote, crush every semblance of organized strength and bracket militancy and bracket in the German working class, beginning with the Communist Party, the spearhead of the proletariat, following with the social democracy and the big trade union movement, end quote. He insisted, quote, whoever even hints to the working class that there is no real difference between the, quote, democratic, end quote, rule of the bourgeoisie and the fascist rule by torch and sword, ... is playing the game to the best interests of fascism, end quote. Expressing his hopes rather than his true conviction, he said, quote, it is entirely unthinkable that the German working class, millions strong, trained in the school of the class struggle for years, having at its head the most powerful communist party in the world outside of the Soviet Union, will permit the Nazi assassins to remain in power without a violent struggle, end quote. A general strike could still topple Hitler's coalition government, as a general strike had stymied a military coup attempt in 1920. Quote, it's not too late, end quote, he argued, but, quote, the time to act is now, end quote. At the end of February, after the German Reichstag building was set on fire, an action Nazis used even if they did not plan it, end parenthesis, Nazi terror began in earnest. The German communist newspaper Rote Fahne was shut down. All 100 communist deputies were arrested along with thousands of other communists across Germany. All communist and social democratic election activity was prohibited. Quote, for what is the party waiting for, quote, for what is the party waiting before it acts? End quote. Shachtman asked, quote, until the streets of Germany run red with the blood of an unprepared, disunited, demoralized working class, end quote. Footnote. In the midst of this crisis, Shachtman had one last factional dispute with Cannon that foreshadowed later major disagreements. Cannon suggested that Trotsky is calling the Soviet army to come to the rescue of the German working class. Shachtman denied that the Soviet army could make up in this way for German communist failure to fight fascism. Soviet intervention could only be a weapon in the hands of an already mobilized working class, not a foreign substitute for action by native workers. Shachtman pointed out that in July 1920, when a Red Army counteroffensive against a Polish attack reached the frontiers of ethnic Poland, Trotsky alone of top Bolshevik leaders had insisted the army could not create a revolution in Poland by conquest. Trotsky had again opposed using the Red Army to overthrow the Social Democratic government of Georgia in February 1921, which Lenin did support and was undertaken by Stalin. Shachtman quoted Trotsky's words, quote, Soviet Russia does not by any means intend to make its military power take the place of the revolutionary efforts of the proletariat of other countries, end quote. End footnote. Shachtman blamed Social Democrats who had counted on authoritarian right-wingers like German President Paul von Hindenburg to stop Hitler, even more than communists for what was happening. Shachtman breathed contempt for Social Democrats who looked toward the Reichstag elections Hitler called for in Munich as the moment to save democracy. The decisive battle in the streets would be over by then, Shachtman was sure. Even the Yiddish Socialist Forward in the United States told its readers that Hitler would be a, quote, constitutional chancellor, end quote. Shachtman raged. Quote, everybody has his role. That of the social democracy is base treason, end quote. Quote, to talk about, quote, struggle on the basis of the Constitution, end quote, at a time like this is deliberately to surrender the German working class, bound and gagged to the butchers of fascism, end quote, he said. Shachtman called on communists to expose Social Democrats', quote, sham verbal opposition, end quote, to fascism by demanding that they act and not just talk. One of his criticisms of communist leaders was their failure to make any proposal for a common fight back, made even Social Democratic passivity look good to workers. As shown, when the communist vote fell 20% in the March election, and the Social Democratic vote rose slightly. Trotskyists acknowledged their failure to save the German left when the militant became a weekly again on the 18th of March. Shachtman got ready for a trip to Europe where Trotskyists would gather to reassess their politics. In light of the German disaster, by the time Shachtman reached Europe in May, German communists were in jail or exile, their newspapers banned, their party virtually destroyed. Social Democrats' sharing responsibility for the rollback of democracy in Europe was confirmed for Shachtman by the triumph of Engelbert Dollfuss's dictatorship in Austria in February of 1934. Dollfuss did not crush the Austrian left effortlessly, however, unlike in Germany. Because the Austrian Communist Party was insignificant, the Austrian left was united. Vienna was a socialist stronghold, complete with a miniature welfare state, strong unions, and a socialist militia. When Dollfuss attacked Vienna's working-class institutions, the workers fought back fiercely for several days. For Shachtman, Austrian Social Democrats' unchallenged prior leadership only compounded their responsibility for the left's defeat. Shachtman rejected the Social Democratic movement's attempt to, quote, restore its exploded prestige by a parasitic association with the heroism of the Austrian rebels, end quote. Socialist leaders had sat back passively while their militia was dissolved. The Communist Party banned, the socialist newspaper closed, and the Constitution abrogated without giving any signal for resistance. They had talked about a general strike but failed to organize one. They had offered to join Dollfuss's cabinet and grant him the right to rule by decree for 2 years. In short, Shachtman said, they, quote, hung pathetically at the coattails of Dollfuss until they were contemptuously kicked away, end quote. The ill-prepared, leaderless Vienna revolt, quote, sounded the death knell of the once mighty Austrian social democracy, end quote. The spread of dictatorship in both communists and social democrats' failure to resist it effectively made Trotsky determined to leave Turkey for a more Central European country, from which he hoped to play a more active role in reshaping the left. In the summer of 1933, he managed to get a visa for France, which he foresaw would become the pivot of European working-class politics after the German left's defeat. Trotsky had chosen Shachtman, quote, a good 100% American with a good 100% American passport, end quote, as his, quote, commissar for foreign affairs, end quote, to handle the trip. Trotsky traveled secretly, which complicated Shachtman's life somewhat in making the travel arrangements. Shachtman booked the passage under his own name, adding, quote, and party. Adding only, quote, and party, end quote. Quote, I remember the agent was very curious as to who the party was made up of, and when I explained to him with a wink that the man and woman involved were foreigners in a very difficult situation. The French manager of the steamship office, I remember this with real hilarity, returned my wink very significantly and said, quote, "Ah, monsieur, I understand perfectly," end quote. End quote. The boat left Istanbul in July 1933, and for the whole week of the voyage, Shachtman stood guard over Trotsky's cabin with a couple of pistols. Quote, "What I would have done if there had been a real attack," end quote, he commented later, quote, "I don't pretend to know," end quote. But luckily his non-existent military skills were not called upon. Trotsky was taken off the boat in the Marseille harbor by his son Lyova, and Shachtman did not see Trotsky again in France. That's the end of the chapter. I'm going to look at the notes and see if there's anything glaring. It's kind of just all citations. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not saying anything important. Thanks for listening.